Somewhere in the world right now, someone is signing a lease, ordering coffee, checking a bank statement, carrying a surname their family has always described as ordinary. Working class, unremarkable, and their DNA may be quietly telling a different story. For centuries, the line between noble and common was treated as absolute. You were born into it, or you were not. Bloodlines were guarded, recorded, sanctified by church and crown alike. A name either belonged to history's ruling families, or it did not. Then genetic genealogists began comparing the Y chromosomes of ordinary families against documented royal and aristocratic lines, and the border that seemed so fixed for 1,000 years started to blur. Some names long assumed to be common turned out to share deep genetic ties with medieval nobility. Others, proudly claimed as noble for generations, showed no genetic connection to the titled families they were named after at all. The paper trail and the biological trail did not agree. And when historians tried to explain why, they discovered something larger than any single family secret, a pattern of unrecorded connection running quietly beneath the entire structure of European aristocracy. This is the story of 15 such surnames, and what their DNA revealed when researchers finally looked past the family crest and into the genome itself. For most of recorded European history, nobility was treated as something close to a closed genetic system. Titled families kept meticulous records, marriage contracts, inheritance rolls, coats of arms, precisely because bloodline determined everything: land, legitimacy, political power, even the right to marry within one's class. Historians and genealogists relied on these documents as though they were biological proof, tracing descent from a recorded ancestor the same way a naturalist might trace a species back through a fossil record. This system produced a comforting kind of certainty. If your name matched a noble house, and the parish records connected the generations without a gap, your descent was considered established. Genealogical societies built entire methodologies on this premise. A name, properly documented, was treated as a reliable proxy for ancestry. It was an elegant system. It assumed, however, something the record itself could never fully verify: that every child in every generation was, in fact, biologically descended from the man whose name he carried. The first cracks in this system appeared not in a laboratory, but in the archives themselves. Genealogists working meticulously through parish and estate records kept encountering the same puzzling gaps. A documented noble line that split into branches which, according to later heraldic disputes, contemporaries themselves questioned. Court records from several regions preserved formal challenges to inheritance, cases where a family's legitimacy to a title was disputed not on paper, but on rumor, appearance, or the timing of a birth. These disputes were usually dismissed by later historians as political maneuvering, and often they were. But researchers noticed the pattern repeated too consistently in too many unrelated noble houses across too many centuries to be entirely political. Something about the assumption of unbroken descent seemed, even then, fragile. That fragility became testable once genetic genealogy matured as a field. The tool at the center of this investigation is again the Y chromosome, passed from father to son with only slow, rare mutations, tracking almost the same line of inheritance as a hereditary surname or title. Because many noble houses kept careful, documented male lines for the specific purpose of preserving inheritance, they became unintentionally some of the best tested lineages in all of genetic genealogy. Researchers could compare a living descendant's Y chromosome markers against other verified descendants of the same historical house, checking whether the biological line matched the documented one. For prominent noble families with many surviving branches, this comparison became remarkably informative. Where the paper trail was long and detailed, the genetic evidence could either confirm it or quietly contradict it. And in a striking number of cases, it did both, sometimes even within the same family. That was not a simple confirmation. It was a signal. Several extensively documented noble lines showed genetic splits that no historical record explained. Branches of the same family, separated only by a generation or two on paper, carrying entirely different Y chromosome signatures. In some instances, the discrepancy appeared exactly where old rumors of illegitimacy had once circulated and been formally dismissed by the family itself. In others, no rumor existed at all. The divergence had simply never been noticed because no one had ever thought to look. The story did not collapse. It widened. If you find this kind of quiet historical detective work fascinating, consider subscribing because there is far more hidden beneath these old family trees than most people realize. Researchers proposed several possible explanations for what the data was showing, and, importantly, no single explanation fit every case. The first is the same pattern found in ordinary genealogy, informal adoption, or unrecorded stepfamilies. A noble heir raised by a mother's second husband, quietly absorbed into the family name and title without any formal note of the change. Not out of deception, but because inheritance systems of the time were built around presentation and legitimacy, not biological proof. The second explanation is more delicate. Undisclosed paternity within a marriage, sometimes discreetly protected precisely because so much depended on legitimate male succession. Historians have long known that royal and noble courts were not free of private complexity. DNA evidence does not prove any individual case, but it does suggest that some officially recorded lines diverge from their biological ones at a rate too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. The third explanation is less about scandal and more about the structure of nobility itself. What researchers describe as parallel ennoblement, where separate families, unrelated by blood, were independently granted similar titles, lands, or names in different regions, later blending together in popular memory into a single house that never actually shared one bloodline to begin with. Each of these explanations illuminates part of the picture. None of them, on their own, explains all 15 surnames investigated. And that, researchers began to suspect, was the real discovery. Not a single hidden secret, but a structural gap between how nobility was recorded and how human reproduction actually works. The turning point came when researchers moved beyond individual family testing and incorporated broader population-scale genetic panels, comparing noble-associated Y chromosome signatures against wider historical and regional datasets across Europe. This shift in scale changed what the evidence could reveal. Instead of asking only does this family's DNA match its own documented ancestor, researchers could now ask a deeper question. How common, or how rare, is this particular genetic signature across the broader population? And does its distribution match what history says about where and when this noble line actually spread? The results complicated the story further. Several genetic signatures associated with historically prominent noble houses turn out to be shared by a surprising number of families with no recorded aristocratic connection at all. Ordinary surnames, ordinary occupations, no coat of arms, no title, no family legend of noble descent. Not the pattern researchers expected. Not even the population most of these families expected. The implication is careful, but striking. In several cases, the genetic evidence suggests that a noble founder's male line may have extended far beyond the officially recorded titled descendants, through unrecorded relationships, informally adopted children, or branches of the family that lost their title, wealth, or status generations ago, but kept, quietly and unknowingly, the same paternal genetic signature. The surprise was not that hidden connections existed. The surprise was how far they had traveled and how completely the historical record had forgotten them. The genome was not erasing the old aristocratic story. It was revealing a much larger, more diffuse one hiding underneath it, one where noble ancestry, rather than staying sealed within a small, guarded circle, had quietly leaked outward for centuries into the general population, through exactly the kind of unrecorded human moments official history was never designed to capture. This matters for reasons that extend well past questions of pedigree and status. For most of history, Nobility was imagined the way surnames often were, as a sealed singular line, flowing backward through time to one pure founding source. Titles, crests, and official genealogies reinforced that image deliberately, because political and inherited power depended on people believing bloodlines were fixed, exclusive, and verifiable. But human reproduction has never respected sealed categories. Across 1,000 years, noble men fathered children outside official marriages. Titled women had relationships the historical record chose not to preserve. Illegitimate sons were sometimes quietly elevated. Legitimate sons sometimes quietly were not who the family believed. None of this was unique to nobility. It is simply more visible there because nobility kept such detailed records to begin with, records precise enough for modern genetics to eventually test. What the DNA reveals is not that these ancient houses were fraudulent or that noble ancestry is meaningless. It reveals that the old model, one title, one bloodline, one exclusive origin, was always a simplification laid over something far messier and more human. Aristocracy, like ancestry itself, was never a single sealed vessel. It was a slow, leaking system, more connected to ordinary families than either side ever knew. Picture a stone keep at dusk, somewhere in medieval Europe, torchlight moving along a corridor lined with portraits no one alive can accurately name. Somewhere below, in the kitchens or the stables, an ordinary household goes about its evening, unaware that the blood in that castle and the blood in their own modest home might, a few generations back, share more than either family would ever be told. No record captures that moment. No portrait commemorates it. It simply happens, the way most of history happens, quietly without ceremony, and is carried forward anyway, in a Y chromosome that does not care about titles, only about descent. This is not a story about nobility being exposed as false. It is a story about how thin the wall between noble and common always was, even when everyone on both sides believed it was solid stone. If this kind of hidden family history interests you, let me know in the comments which noble line, or which ordinary surname, you think deserves this same investigation next. What the DNA ultimately reveals about these 15 surnames is not scandal, and it is not a debunking of noble history. It is an expansion of it. The families who carry these names, whether they still hold a title or lost one centuries ago, remain connected to a long, complicated, deeply human history of inheritance, ambition, survival, and quiet unrecorded choices. Researchers remain cautious about how far any single genetic match can be pushed. A shared Y chromosome signature suggests a shared paternal line. It does not, by itself, prove a specific ancestor, confirm a claim to title, or settle a centuries-old family dispute. The evidence complicates the official story more than it replaces it, and further comparison, especially involving ancient DNA from documented burial sites, will likely refine these findings considerably in the years ahead. But the deeper truth already stands. These 15 names were never as sealed, as pure, or as exclusive as the old family tree suggested. They were braided through unrecorded relationships, informal adoptions, quiet inheritances, and centuries of ordinary human life moving beneath the formal architecture of noble descent. The map we were given was too small. The genome remembers a wider, more connected history than any crest or title ever recorded. And somewhere in the DNA of someone reading this right now, there may be a fragment of a story no family legend ever told, a quiet, forgotten thread connecting an ordinary name to a history it was never supposed to share.